Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Talking About Cooking in English. I'm Bigtree, and I'm thrilled to guide you through some essential cooking vocabulary and expressions today.
And I'm Farah. I'll be asking questions that might help clarify things for our listeners. Bigtree, many of our listeners are learning English and want to talk about cooking. Where should we start?
Great question, Farah. Let's begin with something fun, kitchen disasters. We've all had them, and they're great learning experiences. One common phrase is to burn something to a crisp, which means to overcook food until it's completely blackened.
Oh, I've definitely done that before. I once burned cookies to a crisp when I forgot they were in the oven. Another disaster phrase I've heard is to make a mess in the kitchen. Is that commonly used?
Absolutely. Making a mess means creating disorder while cooking. For example, I made a huge mess while trying to knead bread dough. Another good one is when something boils over, when liquid in a pot rises and spills over the sides.
These are so useful. What about when we're cooking for other people? There must be specific expressions for that, too.
When cooking for others, we often talk about whipping up a meal, which means to prepare something quickly. You might say, I'm whipping up a quick pasta dish for my friends. We also cater to someone's tastes when we cook foods they prefer.
And I've heard people say they're feeding a crowd when cooking for many people, right?
That's correct. Feeding a crowd means preparing food for a large group. You might say, this recipe is perfect when you're feeding a crowd. Another useful phrase is to impress someone with your cooking, like, I impressed my in-laws with my homemade lasagna.
Now let's talk about taste, which is such an important part of cooking. How do English speakers typically describe the flavor of food?
When talking about taste, we have the basics like sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami, but there are more nuanced expressions too, like tangy for a sharp taste or rich for something with deep, intense flavor. Bland means lacking flavor, while zesty suggests a bright, lively taste.
What about texture? That's also important when describing food, isn't it?
Definitely. Crispy, crunchy, tender, chewy, and creamy are all common texture descriptions. You might say, the chicken was perfectly tender, but the skin was deliciously crispy.
Can you share some general cooking expressions that might be useful in everyday conversations?
Sure. To follow a recipe to the letter means to follow instructions exactly. To eyeball it means to estimate measurements rather than measuring precisely. To let something simmer means to cook it gently at low heat. And to let something rest refers to allowing cooked meat to sit before cutting it.
Those are great. What about from scratch? I hear that a lot.
From scratch means making something using basic ingredients rather than pre-made components. For example, I made this cake from scratch means you didn't use a mix. You combined flour, sugar, eggs, and other basic ingredients yourself.
What advice would you give to new cooks who are also learning English?
For new cooks, I'd say don't get overwhelmed by terminology. Start with simple recipes that use basic techniques like chop, mix, and bake. Watch cooking videos in English to connect the words with actions, and don't be afraid to mess up. That's part of the learning process.
That's encouraging. And what about food vocabulary? There's so many ingredients to learn.
Focus on learning ingredients as you use them. Create flashcards with pictures and English names. Group them by categories like vegetables, fruits, or spices, and practice by describing what you're cooking to others in English.
Before we finish, could you give our listeners some final encouragement?
Certainly. Remember that cooking, like language learning, is a journey. You'll improve with practice. Don't get discouraged by mistakes. They're how we learn. The kitchen is the perfect place to practice English vocabulary because it engages all your senses and creates memorable experiences.
That's so true. And cooking with friends who speak English can be a fun way to practice conversation skills while creating delicious meals together.
Exactly. And that brings us to the end of today's podcast. Thank you all for listening to Talking About Cooking in English. We hope these expressions will help you discuss your culinary adventures with confidence.
Until next time, happy cooking and happy English learning. Remember to practice these phrases in your kitchen, and don't forget, the best way to learn is by doing. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye and bon appetit.